Dr. Michael Kugelman, welcome to the Kianistan podcast.
Thank you. Great to be here with you.
Thanks. I've been looking forward to this. I wanted to talk to you, obviously, about what's going on in the region in South Asia generally, but particularly in what's going on between Pakistan and the Taliban government in Afghanistan. You're an expert in South Asian affairs. You're a well-known personality in India, Pakistan, Afghanistan. Would you like to tell us a little bit about your background and how you became an expert in this area?
Sure. So I grew up abroad because of my parents' work and knew that I wanted to study the world. I knew I wanted to study international relations. But in fact, it wasn't until I got to grad school, my very first semester as a graduate student at the Fletcher School at Tufts University, when I took a course on South Asia. I believe it focused on the politics and history of Afghanistan and Pakistan, and I just found it very fascinating. And it was that course that made me want to that helped me decide that I wanted to focus on South Asia professionally, and that's what I've been doing. So it's been just about 2 decades that I've been focused professionally on South Asia, Afghanistan, Pakistan, India, Bangladesh, and the wider SARC region as well. And I'm glad that I took my that course because it's been a very rewarding career and a very fascinating, albeit sometimes frustrating region to study. Would not consider myself an expert. Always would consider myself a student because it's such a rich and complex
Yeah.
region to try to learn more about and understand.
Yes. Have you had the opportunity? I know you've been to Pakistan and India. Have you been traveling to Afghanistan?
It's very difficult given the current state of play there. If I had an opportunity these days, it would be interesting to visit. But I should just say that much of my travel to the region in recent years has been to India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, other places, Nepal as well. But clearly, very interesting things happening in
Yes.
in Afghanistan these days. Very troubling things, in my view, as well. But I really unfortunately, have not been able to go as much as I would like, despite all the interesting things playing out there now.
Yes. I do want to, maybe in the future, I really do want to see if I can get your opinion on what's going on in between Bangladesh, India, and Pakistan. But I don't want to distract us from this topic. But I think that's really interesting as well at the moment.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, I would be happy to have a separate conversation on that. But I mean,
Yes.
I would argue, very briefly that India had perhaps its closest friend and ally anywhere in the region in Bangladesh for so many years, and to suddenly be in a position where it didn't have that ally, Sheikh Hasina, it's really changed things so much on so many levels, and that relationship has really been impacted quite significantly.
Yes, a complete about turn, isn't it? And it's a trend we're seeing in a lot of countries where the change of leadership is completely changing the outlook for that country and its allies, and what's happening in America, but also what's happening in Europe, with like right-wing governments coming in, and everything's completely changing.
Absolutely. I mean, I think that this is a big story in global affairs, certainly in the region that I study, South Asia. But as you note, it's really a global phenomenon for sure.
Yeah. So let's get into this, the situation currently between Pakistan and the Taliban government in Afghanistan. Historically, they've had lots of ups and downs. Um, they've been very close allies, and then we had the USA-led invasion into Afghanistan, where the Taliban government was ousted. Pakistan was kind of put in a corner where they had to choose a side, um, and they probably made a lot of mistakes in that whole thing as well because they were trying to play maybe both sides. Um, and at, initially, my opinion was that the Taliban kind of understood that Pakistan was in a difficult situation where they had to appease the USA, but they definitely had sympathies for the Taliban as well. And um, because I've been studying for my master's as well, the Taliban resistance and their resilience within Afghanistan. And I think the Taliban couldn't really have achieved what they have achieved without the Pakistani support as well. So there's kind of, you can look at it from both ways. So how do you see where we are at the moment, and then we can talk about how we got here.
Yeah, well, what I can say is that where we are now is very different from where we were before the U.S. withdrawal, before the NATO withdrawal, and before the U.S. Pardon me, before the Taliban came back to power. And of course, as we all know, the Taliban had been in control in Afghanistan for several years in the 1990s, and then it came back in 2021. Pakistan is in a very tough spot right now. We could talk about its relationship with the Taliban in previous years, which was quite strong, and indeed, I would argue, quite vital for both Pakistan and the Taliban. But today, Pakistan is in a very difficult spot where it is looking at very significant tensions with the Taliban, a former ally asset of the Pakistani state, and these tensions are multifaceted. They're rooted in many different factors. One of them being the fact that the Taliban no longer needs to rely on Pakistan. It doesn't need Pakistani assistance because so much of that assistance had been rooted in the war that the Taliban was involved in. The war, of course, is no longer raging in Afghanistan, and this has deprived Pakistan of leverage over the Taliban. And I think it's made it easier for the Taliban to push back against the Taliban in big ways. And so what this means now is that Pakistan is dealing with the terrorist threat emanating from Afghanistan, reflected in not the Taliban of Afghanistan, but by the Pakistani Taliban, or the Tehreek-e-Taliban Pakistan, the TTP, which is a separate Taliban from the Afghan Taliban. It's Pakistani, but it is closely allied with the Afghan Taliban. It is largely based in Afghanistan, and Pakistan has been unable to curb that threat, and it has been unable to convince the Afghan Taliban to help it curb that threat. And there are other issues playing out between Pakistan and the Taliban regime now. One is border tensions. I think it's very important to note that there has never been a government in Afghanistan that has accepted the border, the Afghanistan-Pakistan border, and this includes the current Taliban government. It prefers to describe the border as the Durand line. And I think many in Pakistan had expected that the Taliban, because it had been such a close partner of the Pakistanis for so long, that it would essentially come around and accept the fact that this is the internationally designated border, but that has not happened. So Pakistan's in a tough spot. It's dealing with a lot of other border constraints. It's got border tensions in Iran. We saw early last year, there was actually Iranian airstrikes in Pakistani territory. And Pakistan always is going to have border tensions with India, its main rival, mainly because of the Kashmir issue, and the border is disputed as well because of the Kashmir conflict, the Kashmir dispute. So Pakistan is in a tough spot. The Taliban, though, in Afghanistan is also in a very tough spot. As you know, Afghanistan has been dealing with significant levels of economic stress. Certainly when U.S. NATO forces were there, when the pre-Taliban governments were there, a lot of economic stress, but there was a lot of international assistance flowing in, and Afghanistan was heavily dependent on that international assistance. However, with the Taliban having come back to power, so much of that international assistance has dried up because people don't want to send assistance to a country run by the Taliban, which is sanctioned. Some of its leaders are sanctioned by the United States and have been for quite some time. And countries don't want to risk their funding getting siphoned off by the Taliban. So as a result, humanitarian aid has come into Afghanistan, but that's been about it. And the Taliban has been unable to create a viable private sector, quite frankly. It did ban narcotics cultivation and production, which had been a key source of revenue for Afghanistan for many years. So the Taliban's in a tough spot. But the last thing I'll say here is that though it is in a tough spot, it does not face threats to its political survival, in my view. There's really not much of a viable anti-Taliban resistance beyond Islamic State Khorasan, which of course is a terrorist group, Afghanistan-based faction of Islamic State. It stages a lot of attacks. It does horrible things, but it does not take over territory. It doesn't threaten the Taliban's rule. And I would argue that other resistance groups against the Taliban are fairly weak, and they're largely based outside of Afghanistan at this point.
Hey there. I hope you're enjoying this episode. Let me just take a moment to introduce our sponsors for today. This episode is kindly being sponsored by the Worldwide Listings Company Limited. or WLC for short. WLC is a complete A to Z Amazon account management service. So if you're looking to start an e-commerce business, or you already have a business that you want to take to the next level, then get in touch and WLC will be able to help. Just for transparency purposes, let me also mention that WLC is a company that I personally created and am a director of. So when you get in touch with WLC, you will be speaking with directly myself or my team, and we very much look forward to speaking with you to see how we can serve your needs. Thank you. And with that said, let's get back to the episode. I agree with you. I think part of the difficulty for Pakistan is maybe the fact that the Taliban, despite all of their problems, they are pretty secure in their position, which then leads to, as you were saying, they have less reliance on Pakistan. But what I don't understand is why. What is this? So we have an issue between TTP, the Tehreek-e-Taliban Pakistan, as you mentioned, which were historically based in Pakistan's kind of tribal northern areas, but now they've fled from there and they've got refuge in Afghanistan, and they're kind of launching attacks from there into Pakistan because they see Pakistani government as a kind of irreligious government, a kind of puppet of maybe the West. They seem to be something known as takfiri, where there's Muslims who kind of declare other Muslims non-Muslim, which means that it makes them legitimate targets. So they're targeting Pakistan from Afghanistan. So I see. I don't agree, obviously, but I see the motives of TTP. And I also see the irritation that Pakistan has from the TTP because they've lost hundreds of lives, security forces and civilians over the past few years. What I don't understand is why is the TTA, the Tehreek-e-Taliban Afghanistan, or the Afghanistan government, not willing or not able to curb the TTP? Is it that they're not willing, or is it that they're not able to do that?
Yeah, great question. And I think that first it's important to understand the broader context of the TTP, the Pakistani Taliban, which again is separate from the Afghan Taliban. It goes back quite some time. It's not as old of a group as the Afghan Taliban, which of course was formed out of the Mujahideen fighters fighting the Soviets in the 80s. But TTP was formed formally. It was launched in 2007, and it began carrying out attacks in Pakistan from bases in Pakistan around that time. And if you look at, there was a particularly horrendous period in Pakistan between 2009 and 2014 where the TTP was seemingly carrying out attacks every day in every province. It was unlike today. It was largely targeting civilians. So there were just some horrific attacks, and some of them are very easy to remember, such as an attack on an army-run school in Peshawar in Pakistan, which killed dozens of people, most of them students. It happened. It's something that people just don't forget. It was also the TTP that shot Malala Yousafzai in the head. Of course, now the very well-known education advocate. So it was really dangerous for a long time. But then you had the Pakistani military launch an offensive against the group, beginning in 2014. That degraded the threat posed by the group. It killed a lot of its fighters in Pakistan, but it also ended up sending, that operation drove many TTP fighters and leaders into Afghanistan, where they remained for quite some time. It took a few years, but they essentially rebuilt themselves. They got new leadership. They were able to bring back a number of factions that had split off, and they just got a lot stronger. Over a relatively little amount of time, going back to the years just before the Taliban took back power in Afghanistan. Once the Taliban was back in power in 2021, that really helped the TTP. And this gets to your question as to why the TTA, the Afghan Taliban, have not curbed the TTP. It's not because they don't have the capacity. The Taliban drove NATO forces out of Afghanistan. They prompted, the Afghan National Security Forces to collapse. They would certainly have the capacity to go after TTP if they wanted to. But the Taliban of Afghanistan is very closely allied with the TTP for ideological reasons, but also, because they had worked together many times in the past. There had been some TTP fighters that had operated alongside Taliban forces inside Afghanistan. But most importantly is that you've had a number of leaders of the TTP that had previously been a part of the Afghan Taliban, and the Haqqani network, which is a very well-known, ferocious faction of the Afghan Taliban. Several leaders, very high-ranking leaders of the TTP, had previously been a part of the Haqqani network, and the one that comes to mind the most is the very first supreme leader of the Pakistani Taliban. His name was Baitullah Masood, who, like all TTP leaders other than the current one, were killed by U.S. drone strikes. He had been a commander in the Haqqani network. So you have these close links, and some what I would describe as more casual observers would say, oh well, there's tribal allegiances, and it must be that. That's sort of a very superficial way of looking at this relationship. It goes much deeper than that, and I would argue that the Taliban, they don't turn on their allies. They don't do that. You look at their relationship with Al Qaeda. The Taliban had, of course, hosted Al Qaeda leadership in Afghanistan for many years. There's not much left of Al Qaeda these days, but the Taliban, there's no indication to suggest that the Taliban has tried to destroy what's left of Al Qaeda. And it's the same with the TTP. So the main reason, in my view, why the Afghan Taliban has not decided to curb the TTP is that it views the TTP as a friend, as an ally. There are other reasons as well. I think that the Taliban fear that if they were to actually try to curb the TTP by using military force against them, that could prompt another conflict. And that is not what the Taliban wants. The Taliban has tried to base its legitimacy on this notion that it has restored peace to Afghanistan, and indeed the war has ended since it retook power. So there's that. And also the other factor I'd highlight here is that, as I had alluded to before, the Taliban no longer feels it needs to go out of its way to do what Pakistan wants it to do. It's always had some differences with the Pakistanis going back many years, but that's especially the case now. And so the Taliban has been willing to do some to do some things to help Pakistan. It has facilitated talks. It's hosted talks between TTP leaders and Pakistani government officials, though those didn't work. And it also has volunteered to, and I believe followed up on a plan to essentially facilitate the relocation of a number of TTP fighters away from the border with Pakistan to other parts of Afghanistan where they don't pose as much of a threat to Pakistan. But there's nothing to prevent those TTP fighters from just returning to the border, and I think the Taliban has looked at the other way with that.
I think you're right, Michael, because on one hand, I see your point that the Taliban in Afghanistan, they don't like to turn on their allies. And the example of Al Qaeda is a good example in that regard. However, even with Al Qaeda, they were able to kind of strike a balance by saying that we're going to protect the Al Qaeda because they're our guests, but at the same time, they put some restrictions on the movement of Osama bin Laden and Al Qaeda while they were in Afghanistan, to say you can't take those actions that are then going to have a repercussion on Afghanistan itself. So they could do things like that, but also I do think that they have a strong tie, because they have common cause with the Afghanistan government, the Taliban in Afghanistan. They had a common enemy, which was the outside forces led by the USA. But they've had lots of differences as well. I even remember, I don't know if you know, there was a guy called Colonel Imam from Pakistan Army who was highly respected by the Taliban in Afghanistan, which is why he was called Colonel Imam, because every time he went to Afghanistan, the Taliban insisted that he leads the prayers because they respected him so much. There was a number of occasions where there was difficulties in hostages being taken in Afghanistan, and Colonel Imam went there and sorted things out. They kind of saw him as a father figure, and the TTP beheaded him basically. And there's, as I understand it, there have been occasions where the Afghanistan Taliban, while TTP was in Pakistan, they worked with them, but at the same time they tried to keep them at arm's length because they didn't completely trust them as well, because they had, as I understand it, tell me this, as I understand it, I think the Taliban in Afghanistan are more a fundamentalist movement rather than an ideological movement, because what they're trying to do is they're trying to establish Islam within Afghanistan. They're not really interested in exporting a movement, an ideological movement outside of the borders of Afghanistan. Whereas TTP, as I see it, is more of an ideological movement than a fundamentalist Islamist movement. And the two things don't really go hand in hand. So I think it's more of a pragmatic kind of an alliance than an actual like similarities in their worldview.
Yeah, that's a great point. I think you've described it exactly right. And indeed, I had said that the two Talibans are drawn together by a shared ideology, and I think that indeed could be qualified to an extent. Shared ideology in terms of opposing foreign forces in Afghanistan and maybe a few other things. But you're right, there are some significant differences, and absolutely the main one that stands out is the so-called near versus far threat. I mean, for the Taliban in Afghanistan, their chief concern has always been Afghanistan. They've never, so far as I know, they've never staged an attack outside of Afghanistan when they were fighting their war. Now, of course, they were allied with groups, with international terrorist groups like Al Qaeda and the TTP. Let's not forget that the TTP tried to blow up Times Square some years ago when they trained a fighter, and he, of course, was unsuccessful when he tried to do that. But the TTP is much more global in its outlook, even though the TTP itself these days, because of capacity issues, I think it only stages attacks inside Pakistan. As I had noted, it had been involved in some operational movements with the Taliban in Afghanistan. Yeah, I think that I wouldn't want to use the word parochial, but I do think that the Taliban in Afghanistan is much more focused on Afghanistan itself, and it does have, of course, very infamously, a very harsh draconian social agenda that it seeks to impose, which is driven in great part by its supreme leadership based in Kandahar, which is, and this is, of course, where you come with the girls' education bans, young women education bans, the fact that women really cannot have any type of public role in Afghanistan these days. This is what the Taliban is looking to do now that it's in power. This is exactly what it sought to do when it was in power the last time. Now, of course, the TTP, it doesn't, it's a terrorist group. It doesn't control territory. It's not in a position to set up shadow states or anything like that, though it did succeed in doing that during its previous iteration, during a previous campaign of violence in that 2009 to 2014 period. But it's just a very different approach. But I think the TTP does have, or has had, a bit of a more global outlook. They both obviously have have supported the use of violence to pursue their aims, and obviously that's very concerning. But I think that they are different groups in terms of their outlooks, their main ideological goals. And the Taliban in Afghanistan, it's focused on trying to run Afghanistan, which is obviously a very challenging goal. The TTP is trying to overthrow the government in Pakistan, and I should say that the TTP was very inspired by the Taliban's actions in those weeks in 2021, and I think that the TTP wants to try to do in Pakistan what the Afghan Taliban did in Afghanistan. In reality, the TTP will not be able to do that. But I think it's important to think about the impact that the Taliban return to power in Afghanistan and the departure of NATO forces, the impact that had on the thinking and the inspirations and the motivations of the TTP itself.
I think, yes, definitely, TTP is more kind of, their view is to export their ideology into other places. TTP is also limited. Their influence within Pakistan is limited into a small geographical area. So realistically speaking, do they actually think that they can overthrow the Pakistani government, which I don't think is going to be possible at all? Or are they just trying to carve out an area in kind of between the border of both countries, just so that they can kind of skip both ways and just kind of carry on their movements globally? Is that what they're doing? What is their actual goal? I mean, well, I know what the stated goal is, but what is the actual thinking, do you think?
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, publicly they would not state that they recognize that they can't take over Pakistan, but I think that we can get a better sense of their actual goals by seeing the demands they had made when they were having talks with the Pakistani government some years ago. Well, there've been talks with the Pakistani government many times over the course of more than a decade. But looking at some of the more recent talks that happened after the Taliban came back to power in Afghanistan, the TTP had essentially demanded that Pakistani security forces leave Waziristan, which is, of course, a region on the border with Afghanistan, and they had insisted that they would not. Lay down their arms, though they were very adamant that the Pakistani security forces get out of some of these tribal areas. And I think that makes quite clear that the TTP essentially wanted the Pakistani state to cede territory to the TTP along the border. Now, you say that the TTP does not have influence across Pakistan. You're right, and most Pakistanis reject the TTP and everything it stands for. Um, and it's true that the areas where it operates in Pakistan today, unlike in the past, are largely restricted to Western Pakistan, Baluchistan and Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, the two provinces that border Afghanistan to the west. They do have a presence in these provinces, particularly in KPK. So they're based in Afghanistan. Their leadership is based in Afghanistan, but they do have a presence in Pakistan. And I think that they would not be able to carry out attacks in Pakistan on the level that they have in recent years without those networks inside Pakistan itself. I would say, though, that there are concerns that things could change just because, we haven't really talked about how the Pakistanis have sought to respond to this latest wave of terrorist violence in Pakistan. But there's really no strategy. What Pakistan has sought to do is actually carry out the airstrikes not just airstrikes, carry out military operations in Afghanistan that, according to Pakistan, are targeting TTP bases. That's just angered the Taliban even more, hasn't made the problem go away. So there is a fear that the TTP could slowly grow out a larger presence in Pakistan, even if the majority of the population doesn't accept them. If you go back to what the TTP was able to do in previous years, they basically had a presence in every province. They were able to carry out attacks and did carry out attacks in all the major cities in Pakistan, including Islamabad, the federal capital, Karachi, the financial capital. I was in Pakistan a few years ago. I'm trying to remember when, 2 years ago or so, I think, when there was an attack that the TTP carried out on the police headquarters in Karachi. And that really upset, obviously, a lot of people. And I think the psychological effect of that attack was particularly strong because it brought back memories of how things had been previously in that 2009 to 2014 period in Pakistan. I would also just say that I think I had alluded to this before. The TTP generally does not target civilians today. It targets soldiers, it targets police, it targets other security forces, mainly in the west of Pakistan, mainly in rural areas. But if the TTP were to change that approach, it's suggested that it's not going to change that approach. That would clearly, I think, signify that a worsening problem is becoming even more alarming. And I think that might, if that were to happen, that would prompt the state to take a more urgent approach to how to tackle this terrorist problem.
If we're to agree that the Afghanistan Taliban and the TTP, they have pragmatic kind of an understanding where they see common cause, but fundamentally they're different organizations. One of them is more, as we can say, they see the near enemy versus the far enemy, or one is more fundamentalist Islamic, whereas the other one is more Islamist and wanting to export their ideology into other areas of the world. So fundamentally, they're different. Their worldview is different. So in that regard, TTP's worldview is a lot more aligned with ISIS-K, no? And do you think that is the actual difficulty that the Afghanistan Taliban has, that they don't want to irritate TTP to the point that they ally themselves with ISIS-K and then cause a bigger problem for the Afghanistan Taliban. At the moment, the problem is for Pakistan, it's not for the Afghanistan Taliban, and they don't want to create a problem for themselves there.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, I said before, one reason why the Taliban is unwilling to try to crack down on the TTP is it worries how the TTP would respond. And indeed, there is a track record. All of these groups, in my view, all of these groups are terribly violent and have done horrible things. But when you look at the TTP, they've been, their brutalities really stand out in, as you suggest, very much like Islamic State and ISKP. I mean, the TTP have engaged in significant numbers of beheadings over the years in terms of those that it holds captive and others. There have been some incredibly gruesome videos that they have taken and posted online. I won't go into them. They do horrible things to people that they hold captive. And, there have been some particular factions of the TTP. One that stands out is called Jamaat-ul-Ahrar, which had at one point spun off from the main TTP. But my understanding is that it's now a part of the broader group. And it's particularly violent. And I find it hard to believe, quite frankly, that the TTP would be able to continue over the long term to refrain from targeting civilians just because it has incredibly bloodthirsty leaders and factions that are perfectly comfortable killing anyone. So it's this. But anyway, yeah. Getting back to your question, absolutely, this is what the Taliban worries about. That if it were to try to crack down on this group, that there could be big problems, and perhaps a particular concern of how the TTP might respond to an entity that's long been allied with the TTP, and that combination of the TTP being targeted, as well as the issue of being targeted by a close friend. I think the Taliban worries that could precipitate an especially violent, nasty response from the TTP, which obviously would pose major threats, security threats to the Taliban leadership, and also could risk unrest and conflict and all of that. Obviously, these are not things that the Taliban wants to see.
How big a threat or how big a challenge is ISIS-K to the Afghanistan Taliban? And geographically speaking, what is their proximity with TTP?
So, it's interesting that ISKP is the only major terrorist group based in Afghanistan or Pakistan, for that matter, that is not allied with the Afghan Taliban. So, the interesting thing is that ISKP, again, this is the Afghanistan faction of, I should say, it's the Afghanistan-Pakistan faction of Islamic State. It was formed well more than a decade ago by disaffected former Afghan and Pakistani Taliban members. So they've always had a grudge against both Talibans, quite frankly. So the Taliban, the Afghan Taliban, have very interestingly, though I guess not surprisingly, waged military operations against ISKP. Since the Taliban came back to power, this is something that it's done a lot. So it's and this has been very scorched earth, and it's been very brutal. But these operations have killed a number of ISKP fighters, which I think has degraded the tactical threat posed by Islamic State. But there are disadvantages that the Afghan Taliban have in their efforts to go after ISKP. One is ISKP's resilience. I mean, ISKP was hit hard by NATO forces and by the former Afghan National Security Forces for a number of years, and it didn't make them go away. They retained bastions and strongholds in areas of Afghanistan, including especially Kunar and Nangarhar province. They didn't go away, so they're resilient. The other thing is that NATO forces used air power. That was their main tactic, to try to target tactically the ISKP forces. And now we know that the Taliban, the Afghan Taliban, inherited a lot of weaponry, a lot of U.S.-made weaponry that it seized when the Afghan security forces collapsed. But one thing that they did inherit some aircraft and so on, but the Taliban have very limited capacity to operate air power. And I suspect that some might have thought that the Pakistanis, because of their relationship with the Taliban over the years, would have been happy to train and advise the Taliban and enable them to develop the capacity to deploy air power. But that relationship is not in a good place. So the Taliban are learning very slowly to operate air power because they don't have that strong capacity to deploy it. This, I think, limits just how strongly they can go after ISKP, and that obviously benefits ISKP. So the short answer to the question is that the Taliban have been able to degrade the threat posed by ISKP in Afghanistan. We haven't seen huge numbers of attacks over the last year or so, but ISK is still there. They continue to carry out periodic attacks in Afghanistan. And I think what's particularly concerning, and this is where I think that the views of Washington and others become relevant, ISKP has slowly developed the capacity to project a threat beyond Afghanistan. It has started to claim attacks far beyond Afghanistan, including the one in Iran last year, as well as, of course, the Moscow concert attack last year. There was a failed plot to attack a Taylor Swift concert in Austria last year. And then, closer to home here in the U.S., there have been several foiled ISKP plots in the U.S., as well as some in Europe. So one could argue that's not the Taliban's fault. The Taliban has been able to degrade the threat posed by ISKP in Afghanistan, and whatever it does outside of Afghanistan is not on the Taliban. But, the main base, the stronghold, the headquarters, so to speak, of ISKP is Afghanistan. It does have a presence in Pakistan too. So, you could argue that the tactical threat in Afghanistan might have been limited by these Taliban ground offenses, but ISKP is, I think, very slowly evolved to become one of the most dangerous ISKP regional factions that the group has. Given its capacity to threaten places far beyond Afghanistan.
The attack in Russia on the theater that was claimed by ISKP. Do you think ISKP was actually behind that, or were they, or other attacks similar to this? Are they actually behind it, or are they just claiming kind of responsibility to enhance their own kind of reputation?
There have been cases, I think, where ISKP might want to try to garner fame, so to speak, or attention to impress other jihadists and so on, and claim attacks that they didn't carry out. But generally speaking, when they claim an attack, that's an attack that they've carried out. And the interesting thing is that ISKP has a grievance against pretty much everyone. They've had grievances against Russian policies in terms of Russian policies in some of the Muslim majority areas where they have an influence or that they control, or they've waged military offensives. And ISKP and other Islamist militants have condemned Russia's killings of Muslims for many years. So there is that grievance right there. As well as Russia's policies in Afghanistan and its relations with various factions. So there is that grievance, and I believe that there had been indications that this came out after the concert attack, that Russia had been able to, that ISKP had been able to develop some sleeper cells in Russia and had been able to recruit some militants from Central Asia. That had, as I understand it, been implicated in the concert attack. So, yeah, I feel pretty confident stating that really was ISKP that carried out that attack in Moscow.
And also, looking back at TTP, Pakistanis would probably wanting to know, or is there any evidence of foreign funding for TTP? What's helping them grow? Where are they getting their resources from? Is there any involvement of India or any other government?
Yeah, it's a great question. And indeed, the Pakistanis believe that the TTP is indeed sponsored by India. I think when you look at the financial factors here, it's difficult to know where the TTP gets its funding, but I would argue that having been based in Afghanistan for quite some time, it's easy to find resources. And who knows, they might have gotten support from financial support from the Taliban as well. But if you go back and look at how the TTP has been able to sustain itself for many years, even back before it was mainly based in Afghanistan, it has essentially overseen a number of, or not overseen, it's participated in a number of illicit industries that have helped it generate revenue. So this ranges from the timber trade. It's been very involved in that. And there was a period when the TTP, going back to that 2009, 2014 period, when it had not only a presence, but actually control of areas of northwest Pakistan, particularly the Swat area, heavily forested areas. And it was actually responsible for significant levels of deforestation in Pakistan at that time. Anyway, this helped drive this illegal timber trade that it was involved with. So that's been a big part of its financing. But I think that looking at the more recent years since it's been based in Afghanistan, I think that it could certainly turn to friends, and none other than the Afghan Taliban. I am not aware of any indications of state support, external support, financial support. And if indeed Pakistan does essentially accuse India of backing TTP, suggesting that India is also providing financial support. But I'm not. I have no reason to think that that is the case. Though, if you look at the scholarship that's come out on India and its policies in Afghanistan and its relations with the TTP, so to speak, there are some indications of exchanges. But in terms of formal support, financial support, I'm not aware of that. I think it's much more likely that the TTP would get financial support from inside Afghanistan. There's no shortage of places to go, to be the drug trade, things like that. It's illicit industries that it's been able to run in the past, and anything that it can get from the Taliban, the Afghan Taliban as well.
Michael, you've mentioned a few times one of the causes for the tension between Afghanistan Taliban and Pakistan is the fact that the Taliban has sorted out a lot of the negotiations with the West and everything, so it kind of doesn't need Pakistan that much anymore. And I do agree with that. I think even in the worst of times when they did need Pakistan, not just now, but previously when Pakistan was one of the only 3 countries to have recognized the Taliban government, they always wanted to maintain their own independence. They didn't want to be seen as a puppet of the Pakistani government. So I do completely agree with that. But at the same time, I do think that the Taliban in Afghanistan, they do need Pakistan as much as Pakistan does need the Taliban. As long as they're neighbors, they're going to need each other. If nothing else, about 60 or 70% of the Afghanistan imports come through Pakistan, and maybe about 40 or 50% of the exports go through Pakistan, not to mention all of the refugees that are sitting in Pakistan at the moment. So I think they do need each other, and both countries could severely damage each other economically if these things carry on.
Yeah, I fully agree. And, despite all the tensions we're talking about between the two sides, this is not a hostile relationship. I mean, it's not like Pakistan and India. I mean, you do have open channels, there's frequent engagements, there's frequent diplomacy. And, as you suggest, there also is a very extensive people-to-people relationship. And, going back many years, especially during the war years in Afghanistan, you've had many Afghans traveling to Pakistan every day to work there. And you've had cases of Afghan children going to Pakistan to go to school as well. And this is why it's so significant that these tensions in recent years have led to border closures. That's very significant, not just because of trade impacts, but also for people-to-people ties. So I agree with you that they do need each other. And I think this is the case with a lot of these currently fraught relationships in South Asia. I would certainly cite Bangladesh and India in this case, that both sides do need each other. I think that the Taliban recognize that the Pakistan can be very helpful, and it's notable that before tensions really got bad, Pakistan had been one of the few countries in the immediate weeks after the Taliban came to power. Pakistan had been one of the few countries willing to essentially articulate the Taliban's interest on the global stage. So, the Pakistanis had been, calling for the world to provide more support, not just humanitarian aid, but development support for the Taliban. sorry, not for the Taliban, for Afghanistan. It's a very unpopular position to take in the West, just because the Taliban are sanctioned and so on. But Pakistan has been doing that for quite some time, and indeed also just because of geography, Pakistan's location, it borders Afghanistan. And the Taliban and Afghanistan are in a tough spot economically and with so many things. They can't afford to have their trade interrupted. Now, I should say, credit to the Taliban, that Afghanistan has continued to engage in border trade with many of its other neighbors, particularly Tajikistan, the other stands, Iran. Much of Afghanistan's electricity and power is imported from Iran and from several Central Asian states. So, the tensions with Pakistan and the impacts that's had on trade relations with Pakistan, the impacts haven't been as bad as they could be if Afghanistan were not in the favorable position of continuing to have trade with its other neighbors. But
Yeah.
absolutely, I think that the Taliban, it needs friends, it needs support, needs assistance, and so on. And, Pakistan potentially could be very helpful. And so long as the tensions remain there, it's going to be difficult to get that. I would also argue that Pakistan needs the Taliban.
Yeah.
We know that Pakistan for quite some time has been trying to reorient its foreign policy to one that it describes would be focused less on geopolitics and more on geoeconomics. And that's a mantra. It's just sort of like a bumper sticker. But what that really means is that Pakistan wants to scale up its trade and connectivity links with the broader region, less so South Asia, more so Central Asia. It wants to strengthen ties with the Central Asian states. So to do that, it needs to have better relations with Afghanistan because, Afghanistan, if you look at the map, Pakistan can best access Central Asia via Afghanistan. Pakistan is keen to work with the Taliban on connectivity projects, and it would be very keen to see China be more present in Afghanistan to bring the Belt and Road Initiative there. Pakistan would see benefits, but this all requires good relations, or at least workable relations, between the Taliban in Afghanistan and the Pakistanis.
Yes, absolutely right. Because Pakistan wants to access Central Asia through Afghanistan, and for Afghanistan, they're a landlocked country, and they need access to ports,
Mm-hmm.
either Pakistani or Iranian. And I also think I completely agree. I think in this short period that the Taliban has been there, they have improved relations with a lot of countries, including China. But I think if these tensions persist, some of those relationships might be tested because at some stage, because at the moment, China is also finding it difficult because Chinese citizens are dying in Pakistan or at least being attacked. And that's an irritant for China because they want to, the workers are reluctant to come over and work if their lives are in danger. Um, and if China agrees that that danger is coming from Afghanistan, then that's going to test the relationship between Afghanistan and China as well, ultimately, as well as other countries. Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, they still have kind of reluctance and fear of the Taliban and their motives.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you hit on a very important point. And it's interesting. When U.S. forces left Afghanistan, critics of the withdrawal in the U.S. argued, one of the arguments they used against the withdrawal is that if U.S. forces left, China would essentially step in. They would essentially fill this vacuum left by the U.S. Now, that was actually wrong. I mean, that was not the case because China has been very slow to try to invest in Afghanistan and do more there. And indeed, I mean, the main reason for that has been security concerns. Yes, the war ended in Afghanistan, but you have terrorism threats. And I think that for the Chinese, they worry about a lot of things. They worry about ETIM, which is this very small terrorist group, which is essentially comprised of Uyghur militants. It's very small. It does very little. It poses little threat to China. But this is something that Beijing claims to worry about. It also, of course, worries about Islamic State Khorasan. But I would also, the China also worries about the TTP. The TTP does not stage attacks in Afghanistan these days, but it has targeted the Chinese in Pakistan. And this is a critical point. We've been talking about how the TTP has largely targeted Pakistani police and troops and paramilitary and so on. But they have targeted China because of these Chinese infrastructure projects, which are carried out in close cooperation with the Pakistani state. That's the main reason why the TTP targets them. In some cases, the TTP have even partnered with ethnic separatists, particularly Baluch separatists in Baluchistan, to target Chinese infrastructure projects, which are heavily concentrated in Baluchistan. So China has many reasons to worry about the security situation in Afghanistan, and it has held back. Only in recent months have we seen that start to change a bit. Last year, I believe it was last year, if not the year before, a Chinese company announced a new oil exploration deal with the Taliban. That deal was announced. I find this so telling. That deal was announced only after the Taliban gave this large public announcement that they had launched an operation against Islamic State fighters that had been behind an attack on a guest house that had targeted Chinese workers in Afghanistan some time before. So yeah, so China is starting to slowly move up the pace. I think now it's gotten those security guarantees that it wanted to get, but it's still going to be very concerned. And the interesting thing is that China is not exactly risk averse when it comes to how it invests in places with physical security risks. I mean, it has stayed in Pakistan despite all the risks it faces there. You look at its investments in parts of sub-Saharan Africa, even Southeast Asia, where there's a lot of volatility, but it's there. Afghanistan is different, though. China has really held back. So, yeah, so I think that so long as China's security concerns are eased, then I think it'll slowly want to move forward in Afghanistan. But if there's setbacks, if you have an ISKP attack in Afghanistan that targets Chinese workers, Chinese nationals, that could be severely significant, and I think could deliver a setback to China's relations with the Taliban. A relationship that the Taliban really wants to work, because what does the Taliban want from the world? Well, first of all, it wants recognition, or at least the political leadership in Kabul does. But the Taliban wants countries to come in, deploy capital, and not ask questions about human rights and women's treatment of women and so on. China is the perfect candidate for that.
I think it is very interesting what's happening in Balochistan, both the involvement of TTP, as you mentioned before, but also there's investment projects coming in from China, and also the ports being built, and how maybe they pose like a threat, an economic threat to other ports in the region. Maybe we can have like a separate episode on that, because there's a lot to talk about that. Very interesting. I'm also curious what's going on between Pakistan and Afghanistan in the Wakhan corridor, which is that thin strip of land between Afghanistan, Pakistan, Tajikistan, and China.
Yeah, great question. Absolutely happy to have a separate conversation on Baluchistan. Such a
Yes.
fascinating restive region. I mean, not only is it the home of these Chinese projects, but you have this festering insurgency there. You also have, I believe, Pakistani nuclear facilities there, which sort of makes it even more of a sensitive space. So, in terms of the Wakhan corridor, it's hard to know what's going on for sure. There's been a lot of social media discussion, much of which is inaccurate. I don't have any reason to think that Pakistan is trying to, launch some type of operation or anything like that, or try to take it over, or anything like that. There was a lot of attention generated back in, I believe this was December, just a few months ago, when the head of Pakistani intelligence, the new Pakistani head of intelligence, Assad Malik, he went to Tajikistan.
Yes.
And this happened when there was a lot of focus on the Wakhan corridor issue, and people were wondering, well, why is the spy chief going to the Pakistani spy chief going to Tajikistan? I actually think he went there to talk about issues related to the Taliban. I think that Pakistan has sought to very carefully, quietly explore trying to form links with groups opposed to the Taliban.
Yeah.
And at least one of them has a presence in Tajikistan. So I don't know for sure. I don't know the real reason, like the best reason why he was in Tajikistan. But I think that was one of the main reasons for it. And I wouldn't suggest that it has something to do with ulterior motives, linked to the Wakhan corridor. But I really think this is a non-issue. I think this is something that's been blown up a bit. Pakistan has enough issues to deal with at home, and with all of its neighbors, right? India, Iran, Afghanistan, and so on. That it's the last thing we want to do is get caught up in something like that.
Yeah. Yes, I do think Pakistan has been exploring options, because Pakistan wants some leverage against the Afghanistan Taliban as well. So they have been exploring their options in Tajikistan. I think they've maybe been talking to Ahmad Massoud, the son of Ahmad Shah Massoud, who I think is currently based in Tajikistan. Although I think his influence in Afghanistan is limited these days. And also Uzbekistan. Pakistan has been trying to see if they can kind of strengthen their cooperation with Uzbekistan so that they can have some kind of a joint, at least diplomatic kind of push to curb the Afghanistan Taliban.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I agree. And I think we also have to look at these engagements in the context of what I had said earlier about Pakistan's goal of expanding ties with Central Asia for trade and connectivity reasons. And this, as I had said before, I mean, it has significant levels of relevance for Afghanistan because, Pakistan views Afghanistan as a big part of this play. And, there is one concrete example. There's plans that Pakistan has with Uzbekistan to build a transnational railway which would run through Afghanistan back into Pakistan. This is something that the Taliban supports. And the interesting thing is that the Taliban, even before they came back to power, they've long supported transnational connectivity projects that run through Afghanistan. It's very interesting, even those that involve the U.S. or the TAPI pipeline, which is sort of a legacy project. People have talked about it for years. It's not going anywhere. But it was a gas pipeline project involving Turkmenistan, Afghanistan, Pakistan, and India, interestingly, and this is something that the Taliban supported. The U.S. had fully backed this. It was a big booster of this project. So it's interesting. So anyway, that railroad project that I mentioned involving Pakistan, Uzbekistan, and Afghanistan, assuming that it moves forward, the Taliban, even with its tensions with Pakistan, I think would be a big backer of that. It would recognize the potential economic advantages that could come from that. One final thing, just one correction. I miss when I was mentioning the name of the Pakistani ISI chief. I gave the wrong name, so sorry about that. His name is Asim Malik, not Assad Malik. Just for the record.
So, Michael, thank you for this. In summary, tell me if I go wrong anywhere. But in summary, there are tensions between Pakistan and Afghanistan Taliban, but it's not something it is something that can be controlled and needs to be controlled because both sides need each other. Just because of the fact of their geographical location, you can't choose your neighbors, and you have to get along with them, especially if one of them is a landlocked country and the other one needs to get through that landlocked country to get to its market. And at the same time, Pakistan has been looking for options to use as leverage against the Taliban in Afghanistan, simply just to keep them kind of keep them happy, if an lack of a better word. At the same time, Pakistan has been really irritated. Apart from the TTP, they've been irritated by the Afghanistan Taliban's relationships with India. Pakistan feels that it's sacrificed a lot for Afghanistan and for the Taliban. And at the end of the day, the Taliban wants to have closer relations with India. So they're trying to pressurize the Taliban to kind of limit their interaction with India, which I don't think they're going to be very successful because apart from anything else, India has put in a lot of investment in Afghanistan. And just by the fact that they're far away, they're less of a threat for Afghanistan and more of a benefit in terms of financial support. However, to make things more complicated, if Afghanistan wants to have closer relations with China, China's also going to want to see a more reduced kind of an interference from India into Afghanistan. So all of these things together is going to create an interesting kind of an environment, but one that can be controlled and hopefully can get better for all sides in the region, I think.
Yeah, I think you've laid that out very accurately, and I'm glad that you hit on this very striking relationship between India and the Afghan Taliban, which I think surprised many. And I think this is India being very pragmatic and recognizing that its prospects for conveying and pursuing its interest in Taliban-led Afghanistan, it's easier to do that if you've got a good relationship with the Taliban. And those interests, like so many other of Afghanistan's broader neighbors, include counterterrorism and ensuring that terrorist threats to India are dealt with. And it's very interesting that I think at one point the Taliban actually said that they'll ensure that no group will threaten India from Afghanistan. They've never said that to Pakistan. So I think that's very significant. And the Central Asia factor is also key here as well. India also wants to expand ties with Central Asia, but it can't do that in the ideal way because it doesn't get transit trade rights through Pakistan, which means it needs to try to access Central Asia through more circuitous routes, and that includes Iran, where it's trying to develop a port. It may run into issues with the Trump administration's maximum pressure policy on Iran into Afghanistan. And so I think that the Indians also want to scale up ties with the Taliban to make it easier for them to pursue their own connect to Central Asia via Afghanistan. But it's a really fascinating geopolitical picture for sure if you look at this India, Pakistan, Afghanistan, Central Asia dynamic.
Yes. Michael, thanks so much. In closing, would you want to just touch upon, we can talk about this more in detail in a future episode, but would you want to touch upon the new US administration in America and how they might apply pressure on India, maybe, I don't know, tell me, to get them out of the BRICS, or at least to get them kind of as a bulwark against China, and how the pressure is likely to build on China, but also for Pakistan, because Pakistan is going to need to choose, according to the US administration, they would want Pakistan to choose a side between the USA and China. So how are those dynamics likely to kind of play out?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I don't really think that the administration is going to be pressuring India on the BRICS issue. I think that it'll recognize that India is not leaving BRICS, and I think that eventually it would also recognize that BRICS, at the end of the day, is not really a threat to U.S. interest. I mean, yes, BRICS is trying to create new mechanisms meant to counter Western economic models, but it's going to be really difficult to get those things off the ground. Any talk of de-dollarization initiatives is not going to go very far because the BRICS states, all of them, the original members and the newer members, they're most of them at least, they're pretty dependent on the U.S. dollar. And indeed, I know that the president has threatened tariffs against the BRICS states if they were to resort to de-dollarization policies, but it's not going to happen. So I think it's really a non-issue. In terms of the pressure on Pakistan, yeah, I don't think this administration is going to be that focused on Pakistan, but I do think one thing it would like to see, and it will likely eventually convey this message to Islamabad, is to rely less on China. Now, the interesting thing is Pakistan is really keen to get the attention of the U.S., and I think that Pakistan, particularly the Pakistani military, would like to pitch the idea of a new, fresh counterterrorism partnership with the U.S. Because the U.S. and Pakistan have a shared concern about Islamic State Khorasan province. And I think that one way that Pakistan may try to get the U.S., the administration's attention and support is to say, well, look, we're not in China's camp. We want to have good relations with the U.S. and China. This has been the formal position Pakistan has taken for many years, met with a lot of skepticism in Washington previously, and likely with the current administration as well. But I do think that you might see the Trump administration applying more pressure on Pakistan than the Biden administration when it comes to this goal of trying to convince the Pakistanis to do less business with China and so on. And there might be an opportunity to make that push, because I would argue that Chinese infrastructure projects, mainly through the CPEC, which is the Pakistan component of the Belt and Road Initiative, they suffered momentum losses because of China's concerns about security. There have been no new commitments, no new projects under CPEC. So there might be an opportunity for the Trump administration. But at the end of the day, Pakistan has a very special relationship with China. And I think Pakistan is always in a position of needing friends other than China and the Saudis and some of the other Gulf states, as well as Turkey. It doesn't really have many significant global players that it views as friends. I think it's going to need to be very careful and not do anything that could upset its relations with China.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Michael. I really appreciate it. You have really made clear, at least for me, and I'm sure for the audience, a lot of these very complicated dynamics in the region. So thank you so much. And please do share your kind of social media links with me as well. I'll put those in the notes, and anyone wanting to to follow your work can do so.
Oh, well, thank you very much. I'll do that. It was great to have this discussion. It was a great discussion, and thanks for having